What keeps us oriented and alert and out of shock is our history. So a period of crisis like the one we're in is a very good time to think about history.
Sensory deprivation really is a way of producing extreme monotony. It causes loss of critical capacity. The thinking is less clear. The subject complains that he can't even daydream. I had no idea when I suggested that what a vicious weapon, potentially vicious weapon, this could be.
Experiments at McGill continued under the ambitious head of psychiatry, Dr. Ewan Cameron.
What he did was much more than what we had.
Cameron wanted to de-pattern or wipe clean his patient's mind, so he could rebuild them from a blank slate. Cameron combined shock therapy with sleep therapy and the repeated playing of taped messages. It wasn't long before the CIA put Cameron's research into practice. Many of his techniques appear in the agency's Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. These words are from the manual.
It's a fundamental hypothesis of this handbook that these techniques are in essence methods of inducing regression of the personality. There is an interval, which may be extremely brief, of suspended animation, a kind of psychological shock or paralysis. Experienced interrogators recognize this effect when it appears and know that at this moment the source is far more open to suggestion, far likelier to comply than he was just before he experienced the shock.
Milton Friedman was teaching economics at the University of Chicago. He believed economic shock therapy could encourage societies to accept a purer form of deregulated capitalism.
The basis of the shock doctrine is that we've been sold a fairy tale about how these radical policies have swept the globe. That they haven't swept the globe on the backs of freedom and democracy, but they have needed shocks, they have needed crises, they have needed states of emergencies. Milton Friedman understood the utility of crisis. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change.
Richard Nixon ordered the CIA director to make the economy scream. With US funding, everything was done to destabilize the economy. Truck drivers went on strike, bringing factories and shops to a standstill. Chile had enjoyed 41 years of uninterrupted, peaceful democratic rule. Now it was being violently overthrown. Pinochet and his supporters described the coup as a war. It was certainly designed to look like one. It was a Chilean precursor to shock and awe. The boys delivered their economic blueprint, the brick, to Pinochet. With the population in shock, Pinochet imposed the policies recommended by the Chicago boys. Removal of price controls, the sale of state companies, the removal of import barriers and cuts to government expenditure. In order to enforce these economic policies, there had to be an enemy to fear.
Tampoco creo que se haya triunfado totalmente sobre el marxismo.
In 1976, Letelier wrote, "The economic plan has had to be enforced, and in the Chilean context, that could only be done by the killing of thousands, the establishment of concentration camps all over the country, and the jailing of more than 100,000 persons in 3 years." Nixon turned his back on Friedman's ideas and imposed a wage and price control policy. Keynesian policy was a success, and Nixon won a second term with a landslide majority. It was a blow for Friedman. Then in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of Britain. Her intellectual guru was Milton Friedman's old mentor, Friedrich von Hayek. And just over a year later, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Both Britain and America were now ruled by unabashed Freemanites. Within her first 3 years in office, unemployment doubled in parts of the economy, leading to waves of strikes. Thatcher's personal approval rating slumped to 20.
Thatcher back from the abyss and ultimately saved the project was a crisis. Indeed, it was the ultimate crisis. It was a war.
Britain had never even heard of the Falklands. But when Argentina invaded the small group of islands thousands of miles away in the South Atlantic, Thatcher seized her opportunity to prove her credentials as the Iron Lady. The war was over in less than 3 months. Thatcher won the 1983 elections with a massive majority. She could now push through a form of the economic shock therapy witnessed in Chile. A powerful union in Britain was the National Union of Mine Workers. When the National Coal Board tried to close pits down, the miners went on strike. Thatcher used every means at her disposal to destroy the union. Eventually, the miners were defeated. Thatcher used this victory to bring the Chicago School Revolution to Britain. A series of glossy commercials promoted a massive program of privatizations. Thatcher sold off the steel industry, water, electricity, gas, telephones, airlines, oil. Public housing was sold off. Council services put out to tender. On September the 10th, 2001, Rumsfeld made a speech laying out his plans to privatize much of the US military. The next day, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, killing 184 people.
A clash of civilizations. That's the world that we suddenly lived in. That there was an axis of evil, and that we were fighting a war against terror.
The best defense against terror is a global offensive against terror, wherever it might be found.
The first phase of this war was the bombing of Afghanistan.
Message to the whole world. And the message was clear. It was, this is what happens to you if you get in our way.
Many justifications given for the invasion of Iraq. But if the US had really wanted to attack a country where the leaders of Al-Qaeda were thought to be hiding, Pakistan would have been the obvious choice. Instead, George Bush chose to target Iraq, a country with the third largest oil reserves in the world. During the first wave of the bombing, the citizens of Baghdad suffered a version of the sensory deprivation described in the Kubark manual.
Iraq, you had 3 distinct forms of shock that were all working together and reinforcing each other. You had the shock of the war, which was immediately followed by economic shock therapy imposed under Paul Bremer. And as resistance to that economic transformation, that very rapid economic shock grew, you had the shock of enforcement, including torture. 3 different kinds of shock.
One of the first acts of Bremer was to fire 500,000 state workers. This was partly an act of debartification, but slashing governments was also vintage Friedman.
I was in Baghdad in 2004, and this is the period when bombs started to go off regularly. But what was really striking to me in this period was that despite the violence and despite the chaos, the next day Iraqis were out in the streets. Time went on, and the protests didn't have an effect. More and more Iraqis joined the armed resistance.
The first 3.5 years of the occupation, 61,500 Iraqis were captured. The chaos in Iraq seems like a defeat for shock therapy. The war in Iraq is the most privatized war in modern history. The Green Zone in Baghdad is an extreme version of what is happening around the world. A privatized, secure world protected from the chaos outside, going beyond what even Milton Friedman had dared to hope.
The only things I would not denationalize are the armed forces, the courts, and some of your roads and highways.
Maybe the first act of resistance is to refuse to allow our collective memory to be wiped.
Shock doctrine as a strategy relies on us not knowing about it for it to work. And what I find most hopeful about the current economic crisis is that this tactic is getting tired, because that element of surprise is no longer there. We're on to them, and it's not working. We're becoming shock resistant.
Just put my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
So I want to talk a little bit about FDR, because there's a great FDR story, and it could be an apocryphal one, about when he would be visited by some progressive organization or a union, and they would be proposing some new progressive policy that they wanted to be part of the New Deal. And he would hear them out, and he would listen to them, and then at the end he would say, "Now go out there and make me do it." And they did. In 1937, which was a pivotal year for the New Deal, do you know how many strikes there were in this country? 4,740 strikes, lasting an average of 20 days. Do you know how many strikes there were in 2007? 21. Now, the other reason to remember this history of struggle is that it tells us something very important, something that we need to remember at this moment when so much is at stake. It teaches us that if we want responses to this economic crisis that leave us with a world that is healthier, that is more just, that is more peaceful, we are going to have to go out there and make them do it. Thank you.